So I've mentioned many times this kind of slogan, the brain is the organ of culture, which was for me a way to insist that that when we talk about the human nervous system, it's not quite the same as other aspects of our physiology in the sense that it is precisely there to enable us to learn to negotiate a social world and to acquire language and culture. Moreover, human beings have been evolving for 50,000 plus years in environments that we ourselves have constructed. So it's not just evolution like how do you survive on dry land, it's how do you survive in a city or how do you survive in a village and so on. So we have been co-evolving, in fact, with our culture, and we can even show, people who are cattle herders in Northern Europe are likely to retain the ability to digest lactose sugar, milk sugar, whereas people in many parts of the world, when they become adults, lose that ability, and we have lactose intolerance. The distribution of the retention, the unusual mutation is retaining the ability to metabolize milk sugar, because most of the world doesn't retain it well into adulthood. But the people who do are cattle herders, and so it's a direct consequence of the way they've been living culturally. And there are many other examples. And we had the opportunity, again, the last book from this Foundation for Psychocultural Research, based on a conference we had some years ago, and then again inviting in many other people, was precisely to try to lay this out in a systematic way in a book that is called Culture, Mind, and Brain. And the basic thesis of the book is that culture, mind, and brain co-construct each other. That rather than it being, okay, we'll go from brain to culture and we'll explain all of culture on the basis of the brain, or vice versa. It's no, this is an emergent process of coevolution in which our ways of functioning and our ways of constituting social groups are reshaping our brains and our bodies. And I think it's a very rich and interesting way to go. It doesn't mean that any one thing is totally malleable. We have to work with what we have. There are constraints. Culture puts constraints on the brain puts constraints on culture. It's going in both directions. But we have many interesting examples. And this was co-edited with Carol Worthman, who's a biosocial anthropologist, and Shinobu Kitayama, who's a leading figure in cross-cultural psychology. So we really were able, and then Rob Lemelson and Constance Cummings, who's a linguist and coordinator in the Foundation for Psychocultural Research's programs project leader on this. So this has been a really kind of very fulfilling way of bringing these things together. And in fact, next week I'm teaching a course on culture, mind, and brain that uses this as a textbook, but we're pick new topics every year. So next week we'll be talking about meditation and religious experience and psychedelics and the impact of racism on the brain and on people's functioning, and the claims for precision psychiatry, the idea that we can just measure biological variables and give very precise treatment, as opposed to the idea that maybe the real precision in psychiatry lies in understanding people's stories and understanding their life worlds. So that also brings me full circle back not only to my interest in the brain and putting it all together in some ways, but to the early encounter with critical psychiatry. I mentioned R.D. Laing and that sort of movement to sort of critique the ways in which psychiatry, well, it's what Karl Kraus said about psychoanalysis in Fin de siècle Vienna. He said, psychoanalysis turns man to dust. And I think that's maybe an unfair criticism of psychoanalysis, but it's a definite risk when we deal with theories and approaches that exist in psychiatry, where we're not interested in people's stories, where we're not interested in their life worlds, where we're not looking at the political dilemmas that people face and so on. So the idea is to make sure that we don't turn the things that are most important to us to dust, that we don't end up with a simplified story, and that we can really energize them with the best of what we have to offer from many disciplines. The last chapter in this book, I mentioned that the first book we did with the Foundation for Psychocultural Research had a last chapter on the vicissitudes of interdisciplinarity. This last chapter also has this book also has the last chapter is also called Interdisciplinarity in the Study of Culture, Mind, and Brain. And it has this figure, which again maybe we'll have a slide that shows that nicely, that shows all these different disciplines working together in some way to create a rich picture of what's going on. So this is my own, the place that I like to live intellectually in terms of being kind of omnivorous and being able to try to put these different languages together in some way, in the conviction that much as they may critique each other or point out each other's limitations, they all represent a piece of the puzzle in some way. So that's that, and I actually I don't know what else I guess the future of cultural psychiatry. So maybe I have a couple of other things to say about that. And I framed that, you asked me, tell me about my work, but I actually really did tell you a lot about that already. So the last question is, how do you see the future of anthropology? And again, I think I've spoken to that a little bit. We have enough time to finish this? I don't have a lot to say, so we can do this. Okay. So if I think about the future of this discipline, I've already framed this as kind of going full circle, but I think in a way we need to think of it as a spiral. I mean, things are developing over time and getting elaborated. Maybe it's getting wider. The circle's getting wider. More things are being integrated. And I say that not only in terms of my own interests and having excuses to read the things I like to read and think about them, but also what's happening in terms of the dialogue between different disciplines and the ways in which things are being drawn in. And I can see that happening in very real ways right now. My hope is that anthropology continues to be a vital part of that conversation. The tension that I see is because of disciplinary concerns, that sometimes anthropology becomes taken up by fads, there's a new language, a new metaphor, a new trope, a new genre, and everybody jumps on that bandwagon. It makes sense in terms of how to mine it and see what it can do, but I think there's also this possibility of holding on to what we've got that's useful and adding a lot more. And that lot more comes partly from the world around us, which keeps changing. So there's never any end to it. We're not going to end. Right now we're living through a time of huge reconfiguration of human social spaces because of social and electronic media. These are having profound effects on how we relate to each other, changing the scale of the social world. The far is near and the near is far because we're too busy being distracted by the phone in front of our face, and all kinds of things like that. We don't even know what effects those are going to have on our brains, let alone our social worlds. So there's plenty of stuff going on there. We're also facing, the Anthropocene or some other obscene thing that is problematic for us, and that's hugely important for thinking about how do we want to live, what's possible. We just had a visit from David Wengrow, archaeologist, and who with David Graeber, who sadly died last year, just published this monumental book on the origins of everything. I'm paraphrasing, that's not the exact title, but and what's fascinating about that book is, aside from it laying out, challenging some of the received wisdom and history we have, and saying we've kind of, distorted the picture of what human history is like and human prehistory, is pointing to the great diversity of forms of social life that have existed in different parts of the world, pointing at the great, very diverse indigenous societies and the kinds of knowledges and forms of life that they've cultivated, and suggesting that if we're more aware of that, we might have greater imagination and greater will to try to reconfigure our social world. I have my doubts as to how well we can do that, because I think there are powers at work and interests at work that tend to sabotage those things. Some of those powers are just, obscenely wealthy billionaires who have no business having so much, so much of humanity's resources under their control. Some of it may be what I guess is Kroeber or Kluckhohn pointed out years ago, the idea that social systems have their own dynamics. And this idea that society could be a superorganism. There could be ways in which the global configuration has a life of its own, that nobody's really in control, that things just spiral out of, we could argue that that's in effect partly what's happening with climate change, let's say. So that's another dilemma. I do think that anthropology has had this dual role of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, which we need more than ever right now, because the consequence of social media and so on is to put us in our own bubble to a very high degree, and to the extent that we keep getting the stimulation of novelty, it's really metered out in a very particular way without really a full comprehension of what that means for individuals who live that way. So those who can bring us the stories of other ways of living, of other sets of values, of other perspectives are incredibly vital and helpful. One of the people who speaks very eloquently about this to me is Robert Bringhurst, a Canadian poet who has written about the idea of human beings living in an ecology that is both of the natural world and an ecology of language. And we need to think that through. So to me, that the ecological metaphor is helpful, not only because we're living on the brink of ecological catastrophe, we better take it very seriously, but because the implication of ecology, that things are interconnected in all kinds of ways, and that we need to trace that to be good participants in that world. We have to be aware of that, is really what it's about. And for human beings, that ecology, as I say, is not only the material world, it's also our symbolic constructions, our meanings, our language, our poetry. And again, that to me is what anthropology has stood for, is both those, putting both or all of those spheres together in some ways, although not any one scholar is not attuned to all those, but the enterprise itself includes people who can really speak to all those things. So I see that as vitally important. In the area of psychiatry and mental health, we've been arguing all along that this attention to diversity is incredibly important, just like biodiversity is important and the fear of losing it, the vulnerability that we'll have. There are arguments for why cultural diversity is important. There's a systems theorist, scientist, Scott Page, has written a book on complexity and diversity, where he lays out some of the circumstances under which diversity contributes very directly to the stability of systems. The classic example is farming. If you plant a monoculture of one crop, one genetic strain, all it takes is one virus or one thing and it wipes you out completely. If you have 50 crops or just lots of genetic variation in your crop, there's a good chance that, well, some will die, some will thrive, and you'll go forward. And that's the history of evolution. So the idea that could be occurring at a cultural level, the level of circulating values, values that are embedded in languages, experiences of temporality, experiences of identity, I think is very plausible and very precious. But the problem is we don't know. We don't know where the answers are. And if we don't preserve these things, if we don't maintain them, if we don't celebrate them, if we don't give them voice, they won't be there as resources for us. So for me, behind all of my individual and local interests and doing a good job and caring for the people who are, our neighbors and trying to do no harm, I mean, that's probably the most basic thing in healthcare or whatever, there's this broader vision of that the diversity that nourishes us and that those of us who like a high level of novelty and diversity already delight in is also vitally important. And I guess that speaks to the final dilemma, and it comes out of the social media and so on, which is that I've said that some of us are very attracted to a fairly high level of diversity, but there's a normal distribution in the human population. Some of us like the same old is very good. It's comfortable. It's enough. And we want people like us. We want people to be similar. And we don't like people who look different. And we're seeing that effect globally. You could argue that all the populism and the backlash against strangers and all that is partly a consequence of greater exposure, the potential of greater exposure and greater mobility. So we have both things happening, and working that out somehow, finding ways to tolerate and to coexist is very important. And I think our work in mental health and at the intersection of social science and mental health, can make some small contribution to that. So, we're talking about the largest issues before which most of us are just kind of like, this is not a good moment for the world right now. So we gotta. I'm glad you're recording this, and maybe somebody in a million years will lift a rock and see it there. But anyway, we have tried. I mentioned these the summer school. The other thing we've done in the summer school for many years is we've had advanced study institutes, and I'll show you a picture of the posters from those advanced study institutes, because we've chosen topics that were of interest to us and that would push the boundary. The very first one was on the politics of trauma, actually, and it happened because José Brunner, a historian, was visiting us, and Alan Young and so on. We organized this week-long meeting where we talked about trauma all week. So these have gone on for 20 years or so, and they've been wonderful meetings because they're very interdisciplinary. We bring people together with the idea that we want you to prepare paper beforehand because the meeting will be all discussion. So rather than reading your paper and people will have interest, not interest, whatever, you can do a 5 or 10 minute presentation of what you want the group to discuss, but that's what it's about. Then we'll talk for 45 minutes about your paper. And we try to facilitate them in a way that people also feel safe to have a discussion, that it's not about just showing how clever you are or not saying something foolish, but that you can really seriously engage with other people's ideas and try. And the goal also, I should say, is to help the person who's writing the paper. So yes, critique or how about this, how about that, but it's with the idea that you're going to help them advance their ideas. And then we publish selected papers in an issue of our journal. So these have led to some wonderful experiences. We had one on peace and conflict resolution. We had Johan Galton come and talk about, a guy who came up with the idea of structural violence and who's done a huge amount of work on peace. We had a fascinating meeting on mindfulness and cultural context and brought Buddhist scholars and people studying meditation together. So this has been, and again, for me and for others, those of us who organize these things, there's always a chance to invite some people we'd really love to hear, but sometimes are outside our own discipline, but maybe we can set up a meaningful dialogue. So anyway, I'm mentioning that because I see that as the kind of arena. We've had one on on the Anthropocene, essentially, I think we call it Psychiatry for a Small Planet. So we've tried to have these discussions, and for me, it's using the inherent interdisciplinarity of the space that we're in to invite people in who ordinarily wouldn't talk to each other, and who, just because of where they're situated in academia or whatever, and has led to some very, very rich discussions. A lot of these are available online. There are videos, actually, of these conferences, of the talks at these conferences. But that doesn't, usually we have a workshop for 2 days, and then we have or 3 or 4 days, and then we have a conference. So the videos are from the conference. It doesn't capture what happens in the workshop, where you're sitting all day long with people, listening to each other's papers, having lunch together, and it just leads to a whole other level of dialogue that we don't often have, I would say. So for me, that's been probably one of the most rewarding things. That and helping certain students along have been the most sort of rewarding aspects of my career. So I'll stop there.